Hello. So we are still in chapter 9. I hope this isn't getting too confusing. So we're in the second week of chapter 9, and this is part 2. So let's move forward. In our last video, we were talking about other parts of the Constitution and federal laws that related to teaching and learning. Today we're going to be moving forward, and we will start with the No Child Left Behind Act and the Every Student Succeeds Act. So let's start by making sure that we understand what these two things are. It started with the No Child Left Behind Act. Now that one's a bit of an oldie. So it started in 2001, so about 20 years ago, and it was really the first major time that the federal government came in and said, we're going to tell you how you should do things in schools, even though, like I've said before, it should be a state's issue. In 2015, not that long ago, it was reaffirmed. Now, it was slightly changed, but some of the basic foundations of it still remain. So let's see what some of the things are that you should know about the Every Student Succeeds Act. One piece that did remain but was changed is the idea of monitoring schools yearly to see how students are learning. And when they do this, they call this adequate yearly progress because they want to make sure that schools and students are making enough progress from year to year. The way this works is specific grades are chosen to be tested annually. So grades 3 through 8 get math and reading. Grades 10 through 12, you have to be tested at least once. And when you do the test, you can't pick and choose. It does need to be at least 95% of the students at the school. There used to be a problem back with the No Child Left Behind Act that on testing day, they would purposefully leave out students who they knew would be low performers. So this time they want to make sure that they are getting a good sample of the students. States are allowed to decide how they're going to test the students, what they're going to be testing them on. So the states do have some control over how that testing occurs, which is new for the Every Student Succeeds Act. So again, it replaces the No Child Left Behind Act. States do have more control over it. So that way the federal intrusion is a little bit less, shall we say. Here's an example of some of the data. So this is from Ohio. This is looking at 4th grade proficiency in English language arts and math. And so it just shows you that not only do they have to provide data on how the school did overall, but they also have to break it down into subgroups. And one of those subgroups is looking at student ethnicity, because part of the goal of both of these programs is to try to reduce the achievement gap, which we've looked at in previous courses. And this chart specifically shows you the data as well as looking at that gap that occurs. And then schools who are low performers, those specifically that bottom 5%, they get extra support from the school because obviously they need extra support because they need help to do something to turn around what's happening there. I was unable to find a report showing the bottom 5% for Ohio, but I could find a rank order from 608 to 1 of best to worst. And in case you were curious, here are the bottom schools in terms of how they performed on their state indicators. And you can see Dayton was at the very bottom of the list. So let's continue, and I wanted to show you a short video that kind of summarized what you need to know about the Every Student Succeeds Act for now.
Just over a year ago, Congress passed the new Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSA replaced the widely disliked No Child Left Behind Act. It did a couple of big and important things. One, it got Washington entirely out of the business of trying to micromanage school improvement. It also mostly got Washington out of the business of telling states which schools are performing well enough. Second, it created new support and new opportunities for school choice. It included substantial new support for charter schooling, the only kinds of schools that got big new funds in the law, and it created a pilot weighted student funding program that would allow communities which wanted to have federal dollars follow kids more easily. Third, look, it's still a big law, hundreds of pages long, with lots of room for bureaucratic mischief. The bottom line is it's an improvement. It's a good law that's moving the country in the right direction, but how it works for kids is going to depend how it's implemented in Washington, in the states, and in communities in the years ahead. To learn more about my take on the every...
I think the point he made is quite accurate. And this goes back to something we've said a few times in Chapter 9, the idea that these laws are written in a very general, vague way, and it's often in the interpretation of them that we can see their effectiveness. Okay, we're going to be moving forward and taking a look at some issues that relate to teacher employment, which will affect you in the future. So we know that there are certain laws and regulations about licensure, and licensure specifies the minimum level of qualifications needed to be a teacher. And here you can see I just went to the ODE, which is the Ohio Department of Education website, and you can see here on the left the numerous ways. Let me put on my laser pointer. The numerous types of licenses you can look up to see what the requirements are. Additionally, it's important to know that the teaching contract that you receive from your school is a binding legal agreement between you and your local state board. So there are going to be legal issues there as well. And whenever there's some sort of a disagreement where something needs to be negotiated on your contract, whether it is about salary or health benefits, this is usually when the teachers' unions and collective bargaining occurs, all of which are legal proceedings. Something else that you might want to be aware of is the idea of tenure. Tenure is a legal safeguard that protects teachers from being dismissed for either no reason or being dismissed for something minor. Now, tenure is an issue that is highly debated because some people are obviously for it and some are against it, whether it is protecting good teachers or as some fear protecting bad teachers. But tenure is something that you do need to understand. Here's a short video I found that explains a little bit about it.
In most workplaces, managers are given the right to evaluate employees and to terminate them with just cause. Why should teachers be so different?
Teachers should not be so different. But we have to fix the system to make sure we have good evaluations, people are confident about them, and that if somebody gets a bad evaluation, they have to be terminated. We're just looking for fairness.
How would you describe the way teachers are currently evaluated?
Most of the time, what we have is what I used to call the drive-by evaluation, where a principal would come in maybe once a year, maybe for 20 minutes, maybe for 40 minutes, and that would be your whole evaluation. That's not a way of evaluating teachers.
How do you think they should be evaluated?
Have I taught something? Have kids learned? And so, we're doing that in places like New Haven, Baltimore, Philadelphia.
Have New Haven or any of the other places where you're testing these new evaluation systems, have any of those places done away with tenure?
No.
Why not? What is the point of having a good evaluation system if in fact it doesn't say this teacher is good, this teacher is bad, ergo the bad teacher needs to leave?
All tenure is supposed to do, and I actually hate the word tenure, because tenure is supposed to be due process. Tenure is supposed to be fairness.
Tenure is a job for life unless proven that you are incompetent through a whole series of measures.
Tenure should not be that kind of ironclad fortress. Tenure should not be a job for life. What tenure should simply be is a due process proceeding.
The teachers at the Equity Project do not have tenure, and the principal told us he thought tenure was demotivating.
Look, I find that when teachers have due process, it gives them confidence to blow the whistle on things. It gives them confidence to say things where
Like
sometimes they would feel like they couldn't.
So tenure is a very interesting issue. It is something that affects colleges as well as public schools. The way it is determined varies from state to state, but again, is this idea, and I do agree, I'm not a huge fan of the tenure system. It makes it very difficult to get rid of teachers or faculties, even when they're doing a poor job. Another thing that you want to be aware of is something that we call riffing. So riffing stands for reduction in force. And so if a school needs to reduce the number of teachers because of declining enrollment, they are able to fire you or let you go, not renew your contract. There are all sorts of ways of saying it under riffing. And you can riff a teacher who is tenured if there's simply not a need to have that teacher anymore. And it's sometimes called, as you can see from the picture on the left, getting your pink slip. You might recall this past summer, the summer of 2020, when Ohio University let go of a large number of classified staff, administrators, and faculty. You can see below 53, at least at that point, instructional faculty members did not have their contracts renewed. Interesting to point out, none of those faculty were tenured. They were only able to get rid of or non-renew the contracts of non-tenured faculty like me. But the tenured faculty, what they did was they offered incentives for them to engage in an early retirement plan to save money. And as you may or may not know, that did result in a great deal of controversy and strife in both the OU and the Athens community. Let's move on. We're going to talk a little bit about copyright law. Copyright law is something that affects all of us, and I don't think we all know enough about it. So, little question for you. Is all the information on the internet public domain? If you can find it on the internet, is it public domain? Is it something you can use? Actually, no. Let's take a look at this. So, copyright laws are laws made by the federal government to protect other people's intellectual property, which does include their blogs, their pictures, their videos, their things that they put on the internet. It is meant to protect the imagination of these people. So if you have someone that is working really hard to create a YouTube channel with their own original content, you can't simply take their content and try to sell it or use it somewhere else. It is their imagination. It is their creation. So actually, since 1989, every bit of communication out there on the internet is under a default copyright. Whether or not you've actually applied for the copyright, it is considered to be copyrighted material. But there are actually no hard, definitive guidelines on what fair use is for educators. Because you've probably heard that if you're an educator, you are able to use some things on the internet, but we don't really know exactly how much you can use or what says when or if you can use it. And believe me, I have searched for this particular presentation. I have searched and there's no definitive answer. I love this meme below that plagiarism will result in a 0, but feel free to take whatever you want off the internet, because technically taking whatever you want off the internet, if you present it as your own, that is plagiarism. Here's a little video to talk a little bit more about it.
You teach biology, not law, but that doesn't mean you can break the rules, especially when it comes to copyright. Copyright law allows authors and creators to control the use of their original work. Those protections are automatic. Once it's on paper, in a blog, on video, copyright is in place. Don't see the copyright symbol? It doesn't matter. Once it's tangible, it's protected under U.S. copyright law. That means it's illegal to copy, scan, distribute, perform, or display copyrighted material without the creator's permission. So what's an instructor to do? Look for work that falls in the public domain. Look for works with a Creative Commons license. Or make sure your use of copyrighted work falls under Section 107, Fair Use. Consider these 4 factors. 1. The purpose of your use. Is it nonprofit and educational? You're probably covered. 2. The nature of the work. Has it been published? Is it factual information? 3. The portion you're using. Is it non-essential to the whole? 4. The effect of your use. Are there protections in place to limit access to the work, like a D2L login? Some protections granted in face-to-face teaching don't apply in distance ed. The TEACH Act allows the electronic sharing of copyrighted content, but in some areas, like digitizing videos, there are strict limitations. Want to make it easy on yourself? Use the library. Database content like academic journal articles, ebooks, and streaming video already have licensing in place. link, or embed in D2L or Los Rios Google Apps. Using multiple sources to create your own content? Set a good example for your students. Always cite your sources. LRCCD has guidelines to help you obey copyright law and to protect the work you create as an employee of the district. Want the fine print? Check out Regulation 8333 or Sections 107 and 110 of U.S. copyright law. Find links and more information on the library's web.
So as you can see, there's a lot of information out there, and it is difficult to discern what you should and shouldn't do as educators. So one of the best things you can do, as I said, was to try to cite your sources. So it's something that I'm trying to do a better job at myself, the idea of whenever I find something online to include the website that it came from, the author who wrote it, some sort of identifying information to cite where it came from. So fair use guidelines, what is fair use? It specifies the limitations of when and how you can use copyrighted materials for an educational setting. And as I said in the video, first of all, they have to look at the purpose. Why are you using it? Are you going to make money off of it? Or are you using it in a nonprofit way, such as for your class? Next, what type of copyrighted work is it? Is it somebody's blog? Is it somebody's video? Is it factual documentary information? I thought this also was relevant. Is it just a meme? Believe it or not, memes also count. And I know whenever I saw that, I find myself thinking, oh my, I know I've put an awful lot of memes in my presentations. Now, I never state that I have created them, although I do create some, but certainly a small percentage of them. So even when you're copying a meme, even for educational purposes, you're supposed to specify where it came from, although that can be hard to track down sometimes. It also depends on how much of the work are you using. Now, I've heard that 25% is acceptable. I've heard 35% is acceptable, but still the idea that if I'm going to take a book and make copies of it to give to my students, I can't copy the entire book. I can only give them a portion of that book. And the last thing is how much of an effect I'm going to make on the value of that work. So if I'm taking that work to show to my 30 students, I'm not really harming its value. But if I'm taking it from a publisher, if a publisher's trying to sell a book and I Xerox the book and give it to you, I am harming the value of that book because now you're not going to buy the book you should buy. So a lot of things to consider. So here's another one. Is it true that as long as you don't use the material for commercial purposes, you're not breaking the law? I think we've seen that no, that again, you should ask for permission. There are things that you should think about and do when it comes to copyright law. All right, let's move forward and take a look at another issue within the realm of teachers, and that is teacher liability. Did you know that teachers are legally responsible for the safety of their students while those students are under their supervision? So if a student gets hurt, it is on you. So there are a lot of things you need to think about here when it comes to liability. There's a phrase in loco parentis, which means while you are their teacher, you are serving in place of the parents and you are responsible for supervising and caring for their health and safety. I think this is why a lot of teachers have also been concerned during Corona regarding taking care of the safety of all these students and making sure that they wear their masks and that they socially distance. It's a very big responsibility. And negligence. What happens if you're negligent? If you do not exercise sufficient care, you might cause injury to your students. Let me give you an example. As you may already know, my husband is a high school principal. And whenever he hears that one of his students might potentially have Corona, he has to go through all the video of that student throughout the day and see where they were and what they did. And if he sees that that student is sitting in their shop class and spent the entire class with their mask off and close to other students, it goes back on that teacher. It was that teacher's responsibility to make sure those students were following the guidelines. So there are a lot of ways this can affect you. So again, it's a lot to think about. We're going to go through the different elements of what it means to be negligent, and we're going to try to apply them to a couple of examples. So first of all, you have a duty to protect your students. You also have a duty to anticipate and prevent potential dangers. So for instance, if you have a great big bookcase up in your elementary class, something I need to anticipate and prevent is, what if my students climb on that bookcase and it falls over on them? They could get severely injured. So I would be negligent if I did not anchor that bookcase to the studs of the wall, those sorts of things. Failing to exercise a reasonable standard of care. So the degree to which you are considered to have a reasonable standard of care is looking at things like the amount of training and experience you have. Schools should give you certain things like first aid and CPR training. The age of the students. If I'm working with 6-year-olds, I need to be a bit more cautious than if I'm working with 16-year-olds. The environment in which the injury occurred. Did it occur in your classroom or out at the field at recess? The type of activity going on. The presence or absence of the supervising teacher. So was the teacher even present? Because he or she should have been present. And lastly, whether or not the student has a disability. The proximate cause. Is there a connection between the breach of duty by the teacher and the injury or the negligence that occurred? So for instance, if the teacher had been paying attention, if the teacher had been doing their job, could they have prevented what occurred? Or was it something naturally that would have happened anyway because the student just tripped over their own feet? And then lastly, was there actually some sort of an injury? Did something occur afterwards that was harmful to the students? All right, so here's our sample scenarios. So a group of students are running down the hallway. They pass by 2 teachers who are on duty. A student steps out of the classroom and collides with them. He's knocked to the floor. He breaks his arm. The student policy handbook says no running in the hallway. So are the teachers that observed that behavior and did nothing liable? I mean, they didn't do anything. They didn't directly cause the accident. They just stood there. Are they liable because they were standing there? Well, let's take a look. First of all, with duty protect, they should have anticipated a foreseeable danger if students are running down the hallway and they're not supposed to. Secondly, they were there. There was a presence of somebody there, meaning they were there to witness it, so they had the opportunity to do something. Down below, a connection between the breach of duty and the student's injury. Well, the student only broke his arm because he collided with the students who were running. So if they were told not to run, they wouldn't have broken their arm. And yes, there was actual physical injury. So yes, the teachers could probably be found negligent there. All right, 2 students are roughhousing in the bleachers of the school gym while they're waiting for PE to be over with. The teacher's not even there. He's in his office preparing for his next class. His office is not adjacent to the gym. It's back in the locker room. One of the students falls down, strikes his head, knocked unconscious, mild concussion. Was the PE teacher negligent? Well, we can look at some of the same things. Perhaps he should have anticipated these potential dangers of leaving younger students alone in the gymnasium. Nextly, the environment. They were on bleachers, which aren't the safest things in the world. Nextly, he wasn't even there, and he should have been as a supervisory teacher. And yes, I would say there's a connection between his absence and the injury, and yes, there was actual damage. So in that case, yes, the teacher could be found negligent. So again, it certainly makes you think again about some of your responsibilities as a teacher. Let's continue looking at some other student rights. First of all, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a really big and important piece of laws and regulations that we have actually already covered in a previous chapter, and it is all meant to ensure that students with disabilities have the same opportunities as other students, the same opportunity to get an education. And it requires that these students with disabilities are educated with regular students whenever possible and in as normal of a classroom setting as possible. There's a lot to know when it comes to special education law, and if you choose to go into special education, you will take specific courses in this to gain more information, but here's a quick summary.
Hello and welcome to Teachings in Education with Frank Avella. The history of special education. In the United States today, all students with disabilities have the right to special education services and a free public education. These children are protected by laws. Students classified as having disabilities are afforded accommodations and modifications. Accommodations are related to access of content, while modifications allow for changes to content. No doubt, these students benefit greatly from them today. However, this wasn't always the case. It was only with the help of certain advocacy groups. These advocacy groups were usually formed by parents of students with special needs and other members of that community. The advocacy groups lobbied and fought for these children by bringing their plight to the public eye, as well as putting pressure on local and state politicians. They got the public involved. Now, let's look at a quick outline of events beginning in the early 1800s that led to the achievements of today. Years ago, most students with disabilities did not attend school, and in most cases, they were not accepted to schools. There are exceptions where some parents would have to pay money to get their child into private schools or pay for private tutors. Let's move along to the 1850s, where a growing number of isolated schools for students with disabilities were available. These schools were mostly in rural areas, but were moving in the right direction. Moving toward the 1880s, we sort of took a step back for disabled children. Scientist Francis Galton spread the ideas of eugenics, which discussed the sterilization of disabled individuals. Individuals with disabilities began being placed in institutions, many of which provided conditions similar to a jail. Let's fast forward to the 1920s. And the good news is that more and more children with disabilities were finding their way into public schools. Yet almost all were in separate classes and kept in separate rooms. Then, to an important time, the 1970s, which is really where special education started. Laws were put in place for funding for special education students. And Public Law 94-142 was passed as the foundation for special education. Continuing to the 1990s, where important laws such as IDEA of 1990 was passed, and students had the right to general education curriculum. And if you look at schools today, we see a push towards what is called the inclusion movement, which basically ensures all students with disabilities have the opportunities to participate with non-disabled general education peers. Right now, I want to say thank you for your time. Please like and share this video, subscribe to the channel. Also, help keep me going with a small contribution to my PayPal me link.
Oh, I should have cut that off a little sooner, but still, aside from the few typos that were on there, it still has some good information regarding the history of law as well as the history of schooling for students with disabilities. Something else we need to know within the world of students' rights and privacy is FERPA. FERPA. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And it requires schools to make sure that they are ensuring the privacy of students and ensuring the privacy of their academic records. And it also makes sure that parents have rights to that information regarding their child's records, that they are able to see their students' records, that they're to be informed of things regarding their children. So for instance, I can't call in an 8th grader and let's say I'm going to give them detention or out of school suspension or something like that. I must inform the parents. I can't just talk to the student and then let the student go away. I have to let the parents know what's going on. It also talks about how we need to make sure we have procedures to let parents challenge things that they think are inaccurate in their students' records, and to protect them from disclosure of confidential information without their consent. So to make sure that other parties aren't getting information that parents don't know about, that we're not contacting CPS or counselors and not telling the parents. This also, there's one piece of it though, it does exclude teachers' private notes and grade books. teachers' memos to administrators. So there are certain things that aren't included in this. So if a teacher keeps a private diary of what's happening in their class, that's something that they're not expected to hand over to the parents. Also, with FERPA also means that I'm not to publicly post students' grades. So back when I went to school, after you would have a test, they could put a piece of paper up on the wall and I could look and see Mindy got a 92% and everybody else in the class could see it too. FERPA now protects that information and other students are not supposed to know how we're doing in the class. It's supposed to be private information. Okay, but what about like the meme shows there when the teacher says, pass the paper to the person behind you and you guys are going to grade each other's papers? Initially, that was against FERPA because there goes student privacy. If I bomb on that quiz, the person behind me who's grading it is now going to know that I bombed on that quiz and I could be embarrassed. But there has now been an amendment to this saying that you can ask other students to grade homework as long as it's part of some sort of classroom instruction. So there are sometimes loopholes. FERPA, I'd like to point out, is very different in college. I think this meme is very pertinent. So not only have I been a college professor for a long time, but I've been a college administrator too. And I've had parents call me on the phone. I've had parents email me wanting to know how their students are doing, wanting to get grade information. And at the college level, we are not allowed to tell them. So even if they say, hey, I pay her tuition, you tell me what I want to know. FERPA, I can't, because once you go to college, you're now legally an adult, and in the college setting, I'm not permitted to tell a parent how you're doing. The only way I can tell a parent how you're doing is if you expressly sign a document telling me and giving me the right to talk to your parents about your grades. So, interesting to know. So FERPA has now come up again in this whole online world, thanks to COVID, looking at teaching online and how we're protecting privacy when we have students in Zoom chat rooms and doing things online all the time. Here's a good example of this. So this is a high school class. They're in the middle of a video conference and an unknown man, not part of their class, joined the meeting and exposed himself and started shouting obscenities to the whole class. Okay, obviously shocking, obviously unexpected. This is one of the numerous examples out there of what they called Zoom bombing. And Zoom bombing was the first thing that brought this to the attention of the authorities, the idea of, that's quite an invasion of privacy was the way they saw it. Now, I have to admit, when I hear that problem, my first thought is not FERPA, invasion of privacy. My first thought is, how can we let strangers come into these meetings and do obscenities in front of students? To me, that's the bigger issue. But still, there's the FERPA issue. So the idea that these products, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, are not necessarily meant, or at the time they weren't geared toward privacy protection. So they've had to look again at how to do some of these kinds of video conferencing and things and ensure the privacy of the students involved. Which is why sometimes they'll also say, that you don't have to turn on your camera if you don't want to. Okay, before we move any further into the world of corporal punishment, I think we're going to stop here. I've had a moment to think about it and actually change the plans. Let's keep going. Let's try to just have 2 videos for this week. So let's plow forward. Corporal punishment. While we're looking at laws and things, let's keep moving. So corporal punishment, believe it or not prohibited by the Constitution. So this doesn't mean for every state. Remember, states have the ability to make up their own rules. It is prohibited in 28 states as well as in DC. So if you'd like to see the map, here's the map as of 2016. It is the lighter colored states where spanking is considered illegal. But you'll notice in many, many southern states, more than half the country, spanking, corporal punishment, is still legal.
An old school punishment that you might think does not exist anywhere, again, around here, but paddling students is still legal in Kentucky. WHS 11's political editor Chris Williams explains why an effort to ban corporal punishment in our schools is going to be a hot topic of conversation tomorrow at the state capitol.
Maybe corporal punishment triggers an image like this in your mind. 50 years ago, school officials could give a child a good paddling if they needed to be squared away. It's still legal in 19 states, including Indiana and Kentucky. Now, for the first time in a 3-year effort, a ban is taking a real first step towards passing in Kentucky.
It is ineffective. It's anachronistic.
Terry Brooks and Kentucky Youth Advocates backed the Republican-led House Bill 22. The only new wording this time says reasonable athletic and military training is not corporal punishment. Kentucky Youth Advocates will send young people to testify at an early Tuesday hearing.
50 years ago was totally accepted, and we've learned over those years in what works in schools and what works in a lot of places.
But Terry, there are people who are going to hear that it worked 50 years ago, or that's what they did 50 years ago, and our schools didn't have the problems they have now. What do you say to those people?
Well, that would be a very naive and misplaced reading of the situation.
According to data compiled by Kentucky Youth Advocates, corporal punishment was applied 284 times last year. That was down from more than 450 the year before. They reported 334 instances in the 2016-2017 school year. Brooks claims it's a discriminatory practice with no benefit.
So we know that, for instance, students with disabilities are hit with inanimate objects more frequently than other students are.
If HB 22 clears committee, it'll still have a long way to go to become law. But the supporters hope that 2020 will be the year Kentucky finally focuses on joining the majority of U.S. states and turning away from that old tradition of paddling away bad behavior.
And in fact, when it comes to educational researchers, pretty much all psychologists and educational researchers agree that it is not effective, that the bad outweighs the good, and that there are many more negative effects than positive to corporal punishment in the classroom. All right, we're going to be ending with the segment looking at teachers' personal lives. And this is a really interesting area because there aren't a lot of specific laws on this, as we've seen, but teachers are held to what seems to be a higher standard when it comes to their personal behavior. When teachers break the law, what tends to happen is the notoriety or the controversy, the amount of stir in the community, can often determine whether or not the teacher is dismissed. So you might find teachers in some states can get away with certain things, whereas teachers in other states cannot. So there's a lot of differences in terms of how some of these cases are handled depending upon where you are. And so, yeah, I love this meme. It would be great if they could, make up their mind and put something down on paper, but neither the U.S. Supreme Court or the states have clearly determined when it comes to personal behavior of teachers what is prohibited and what is permitted. So I thought I'd provide you with some examples. Here's one. So this is a teacher who on Snapchat made this post, and she was complaining about parents who were able to spend excessive amounts of money on renting horses for a birthday party, but they can't buy their kids school supplies. So she's venting. She's venting online about parents. And she did get investigated for that. I'm not certain if she got fired, but she did get put on leave and investigated. So obviously that was considered controversial. Here's another one. So this is a teacher who posted this picture of themselves while they're in Europe. Okay, so she's in Europe. She's traveling on her own time. She posts a picture of herself. She got fired for that. I don't know, but I find that a little bit scary. Not that I'm a big drinker by far, but I would like to think that if I could go on vacation with my family and post a fun picture of myself, that there won't be repercussions back at my employment. And that also might depend upon where they're located. I'm not sure what state she was in. So I thought I should provide you with this information because it's not out there in many of your textbooks. What can you do to protect yourself when it comes to social media? Now, this is a small list. I provide a much larger list in the EDTE 2000 course, but let's start with don't post anything related to a student. Even if you think it's nice, no matter how harmless you think it is, just simply don't post anything about your students, even if you don't leave their name in. So for instance, I have a friend who's a teacher out west, and he routinely and constantly is posting what he sees are funny examples from his students' homeworks or things that his parents say that he finds infuriating. I honestly don't see how he hasn't gotten in trouble for this, because you really shouldn't be posting anything about your students or your parents online. Here's an example. So this is a teacher who posted this. I can't believe she posted this. She says, well, I have an annual IEP this morning with lawyers and crazy parents. The student is a hot mess, but so sweet. So after work, I'm hitting happy hour, blah, blah, blah. Well, she did get fired for that, which I can see why. So not only is she specifically talking about parents, about a student, calling a student a hot mess, and also talking, pointing out that the student has an IEP. Not good. So don't post anything related to a student. Don't join groups that might be considered unprofessional or inappropriate. If you're currently a member of any such group, leave it. Because other people can see what groups you're in online. All they have to do is, if they join the group too, they can see that you're there. And they might be joining the group just to see if you're there. If you're on Facebook, anybody can see what groups you like. So if you like a particular political candidate, if you like a particular controversial person or controversial group, I can get on there and I can see it. That is public information for anybody. So keep that in mind. Same thing with Twitter. The idea, that you are what you eat. Okay, you are what you like and what you retweet. So by retweeting what someone else has put out there, it's the same thing as endorsing it, and that can get you in trouble too. Also, keep your personal and your private lives, same thing. Keep your personal and your professional lives separate, okay? So the idea of, regardless of what your policy is, never, ever, ever, ever use school property for personal communications. Don't get on your computer at your school classroom and check your Yahoo account or get on Facebook. If you take home one of their laptops, don't use it. So here's an example. So this is a teacher who had to resign because he was given a school-issued laptop. And it is easy to forget and to feel like it's yours, but it is school-issued. They can check and see what you're doing, and they are checking. And he was using it to look up porn. So obviously not a good thing. Here's another one, and this one's horrible. So this is a teacher who let a student borrow her cell phone to be nice because the student needed to call their parents to pick them up. So the teacher's being kind-hearted and nice and says, here's my phone. Go ahead and call your parents. Well, student starts looking through the phone, finds nude selfies of the teacher on the teacher's phone, and sends it out to everybody. And the next day, a whole Facebook page with them was created called Thought That Hoe Over There, with hacked photos that went viral from the teacher's phone. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And the teacher was fired for it. Okay, because if you think about it, all the teacher was doing was being nice and saying, here's my phone. It was the student who did something wrong. That was the teacher's personal private property. But because it was stolen, the teacher still is the one who got sacked. Keep a clear distinction between your personal and your professional identities online. So for instance, I have a Facebook page. It is a personal page. It is just for me and my family and my friends. I do not connect with any students on it because that is the advice. Through my personal account, I should not do that. Teachers have gotten in trouble and have gotten fired for that. Here's one who got fired for not only friending her students, but, and this was really where she drew the line, she was giving them personal advice and giving them support. Personally, I think this teacher's probably a sweetheart. I think she was probably just really trying to help her students, and she might have genuinely helped them. But there's a line you can't cross. You're not supposed to give your students one-on-one personal opinions, feedback, talk about their personal lives online. So here's another one. This sweet substitute teacher fired because she wouldn't unfriend students on Facebook because she liked to keep in touch with the little students that she had, and she got fired for it. So again, this is the end. I'm glad we plowed through to get it finished. There's, as you can see, chapter 9 has so much information, and I didn't even cover it all. But thank you so much for your attention, and ta-da! Clap. That's the end of chapter 9. Thank you very much.